different phases before he died.
Mm-hmm.
And he saw all his sisters and brothers and his mother and father, which are my great-grandparents and my grandparents. And there was one time, well, about the same time, what I'm going to tell you, he was acting like half his age, like he was 40 years old. Have you ever heard of that, acting half your age?
The age changes.
Yeah,
yes.
that's what you were saying.
Yes. I have heard of that. And we have a number of accounts where the people, when they come back, this is in the deathbed visions, appear younger than they did at the time of their death. And this is something which is very common also in near-death experiences. And it does seem that there is a sort of healing which goes on of the people who have died in the visions of them that people have. So, yes, it is reported.
It's an intriguing thought that you're probably feeling your oldest and your most frail, and then somewhere in the process of reconciling yourself to death, it's like the clock has turned back, and you can spend your last few hours feeling like a much younger person again.
Yes.
Love that. Maria is in Sunnyvale, California, on Coast to Coast AM for Dr. Peter Fenwick. Maria?
Hi, Ian. Hi, Doctor.
Hi.
When my stepdad died, me and my daughters had driven up 3 hours to go see him in the morning. Daddy did pass away. And we had spent the morning with him and left about noontime, and he was still alive. And on the way home, the 3 hours home, we stopped at a restaurant to have lunch. And it took forever and ever and ever to have lunch for it to get delivered. And I kept looking into the kitchen, and I kept looking and looking, where's our waitress, where's our food, now all of this. Well, finally it got there. We ate. And then, I said, man, we've been here over an hour. We got to get back on the road. And but we didn't have a watch on, and all of a sudden I looked at the door that I had been looking at, and there was a clock right above it, and I had never seen that clock, and it said 2:03. So then and I looked at my girls and I go, look, there's a clock. I said, it's 2:03. I said, we got to get going. So then finally the waitress came. We paid. We get in the car. My mother calls, and she goes, he just passed away. I go, Mom, what time? And she goes, 2:03.
Gosh. Yeah.
And, it just, I go, I can't believe that's when I saw this clock. I said, I've been here over an hour in this restaurant and looking at that door that whole time for the food, for the waitress and everything. I said, I did not see that clock.
That's amazing.
And then I saw the clock, and it said 2:03, and she called.
I think that's really interesting. And it reminds me also of what happened in Japan. There was a man who worked for the Ministry of Defense, and he collected stories from the widows of people who were killed on the battlefield. And he reported that the widows sometimes experienced in some way what was going on the battlefield with their husbands when they died. And it looks as if in some way your mother was linked with you at the time of her death. And so you looked at the clock and it was 2:03.
This reminds me actually of a guest we had a couple of months ago who has written about the extraordinary experiences, the supernatural experiences of extreme athletes, and how under certain circumstances they have had visitations. And one of these was a story about some people who had been visited by somebody who was climbing Mount Everest. And I'd really love to hook you up with her if you'd like to talk to her. She's written almost a whole book about these supernatural experiences and including the prolonged visitation that she got regularly from somebody that she had been involved with, who died on Everest, and the visitations didn't stop until she made the effort to climb up there and sort of reconcile herself with his death. And I'd love to shoot you her email address, because I think you'd find that fascinating, Dr. Fenwick.
It'd be absolutely fascinating. Yes, I'd like that very much.
Several great books. Larry is in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, on Coast to Coast AM for Dr. Peter Fenwick. Larry?
Good evening, gentlemen. In all the years that they've talked about NDEs on Coast to Coast, I've never heard this question asked. What happens when several people die together in a plane, a bus, a train?
Oh, great.
Do they see each other on the other side? Do they communicate with each other? Do they flip a coin to see who's going to come back? I mean, has there ever been reports where people have reported seeing the people that they died with, or are they all in some individual space and time?
A mass NDE, as it were.
That's a really interesting question. I've studied a lot of NDEs, and I know of only one such experience. And this was told by a person who was dying in an intensive care unit. I think it was after an accident. There were 2 or 3 of them in the intensive care unit. And in his NDE, this man saw himself. Actually, they were flying through the air towards the light, and he recognized that beside him was flying one of the other people in the next door bed, and they were flying towards the light. And at some point, as they were getting close to the light, the guy who's telling the story said that he had to come back, and the other guy flew on and disappeared into the light, and he came back. And, of course, when he regained consciousness, he found the other guy had died. That's the only story I know of a sort of common shared NDE.
And that reminds me of someone we've had on a couple of times in the show, a woman named Dr. Janice Amatuzio, and she is a coroner here in Minnesota, where I live, and she had cataloged a couple of these occurrences where somebody was having a near-death experience, left the room, saw things they could not have possibly have seen, heard things that were happening while their body was, medically speaking, dead on the table. Heart stopped, brain activity stopped, and yet they were able to remember things that had happened, so that when they came back, they told the doctors they sort of filled in the narrative of what had happened while their heart had stopped. Do you run into that too frequently?
Well, what we're doing is we're doing a prospective cardiac arrest study, and this is being driven by Dr. Sam Parnia, who's working in New York at the moment. And in the UK, he's got 20 hospitals with boards up in their intensive care departments. And the aim of that is to see if people, when they've had a cardiac arrest, no pulse, no respiration, no brainstem reflexes, whether they report that they have left their bodies and watched the resuscitation process, and whether they then go on to have an NDE. Now, in that, they can gain information apparently when their brain isn't functioning, certainly about the arrest. And some of them, of course, report also that they see things in other rooms. So we're doing that in a prospective way and see whether or not we get good data from it.
Connie is in Nevada, a first-time caller line for Dr. Peter Fenwick on Coast to Coast AM. Connie?
Yes, Ian and Dr. Fenwick. It's very, very interesting. I had an experience with my mother just prior to her death. She had seen her father before she passed away, and then she had a fall, and we had to move her. And I was looking for a place to relocate her, and I came up to a road that I had to turn either left or right. And I kept in my brain getting a message, you have to go straight. And I looked at the road, and I went, I can't go straight. I have to go left or right. And I got that message again. I pulled into what was straight ahead. It was a parking lot of a hospital. I went in, looked around to try and figure out why I was supposed to be there. Ran into a Catholic priest, talked to him, and told him I was looking for a place for my mother, and he helped me find a place. And long story short, a year later, my mother had a heart attack and ended up in that hospital. She had Alzheimer's, couldn't